The Lodz Ghetto was one of the most tragic and longest-lasting places connected to the Holocaust during the Nazi occupation of Poland. It became the second-largest ghetto in occupied Europe after Warsaw and was known for its strict isolation and a very specific internal system of control. Unlike the Warsaw Ghetto, where smuggling networks operated constantly, the Lodz Ghetto was almost completely cut off from the outside world. It was surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by police. The ghetto even had its own form of money. Ordinary currency was replaced by special notes called ghetto marks, commonly known as rumki, which had no value outside the ghetto itself. The name of this currency came from Chaim Rumkowski, the head of the Jewish administration inside the ghetto. He remains one of the most controversial figures connected to Lodz. Appointed by the Nazis as the leader of the Jewish Council, Rumkowski held enormous power within the ghetto. Residents were forced to obey his authority. He could influence which people would be placed on deportation lists and which might temporarily remain. Under his administration, the ghetto developed its own police force, prisons, and a network of factories. Life inside this closed district was strictly controlled, and nearly every aspect of daily existence passed through this administration. Yet despite the attempt to turn the ghetto population into a productive labor force, the Nazi policy of extermination eventually spared almost no one, including Rumkowski himself. But this story is not primarily about Rumkowski. It is about a young German Jewish girl who was deported to the Lodz Ghetto together with her mother and sister, and about the fate that awaited them there. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 pushed Nazi policy toward a far more radical stage in what they called the Jewish question. In the territories captured in the East, mass shootings of Jewish men, women, and children were already taking place. At that moment, however, many Jews living in Western Europe and in Germany itself had not yet experienced such mass killings. Some Nazi leaders still believed that once the war ended, these populations would simply be deported further east. Exactly what would have happened to them after the war remains uncertain. At that time, extermination camps had not yet been fully established. Most likely, many would have been forced into extremely harsh regions under German control in the Soviet Union, where large numbers would eventually die over time. By August 1941, however, some high-ranking Nazi officials were becoming impatient with these plans. They already knew how brutally Jews were being treated in the Eastern territories, and began to argue that Jews living in Germany should also be deported there without delay. One of the strongest advocates of such measures was Joseph Goebbels, the Gauleiter of Berlin and the Nazi Minister of Propaganda. During meetings with Hitler, he repeatedly argued that Jews should be removed from Berlin and sent east. Goebbels claimed that while German soldiers were fighting and dying on the Eastern Front, Jews were still living in Berlin. This argument ignored the fact that the Nazis themselves had forbidden Jews from serving in the German army, even though many German Jews had fought for Germany during the First World War and had received military decorations for their service. Despite Goebbels' pressure, Hitler initially resisted authorizing large-scale deportations of Jews from Germany. At that stage, he still considered the war to be the primary priority. The so-called Jewish question, in his view, could wait until later. Nevertheless, Hitler did agree to one of Goebbels' demands. Jews in Germany were now required to wear the yellow star. Anti-Jewish policies inside the Reich became increasingly severe. While Jews in occupied Poland had already been forced to wear identifying marks earlier in the war, Jews in Germany had avoided this humiliation until then. Throughout the summer and early autumn of 1941, several Nazi officials continued urging Hitler to approve deportations. After the British bombing of Hamburg on September 15th, the local Nazi leader Karl Kaufmann wrote directly to Hitler asking permission to remove the city's Jewish population. Their homes, he argued, could then be used to house Germans displaced by the bombing. Only weeks earlier, Hitler had stated that Jews from the Reich would not yet be deported. But by September 1941, his position suddenly changed. Deportations to the east were now authorized. This decision was closely linked to developments on the Eastern Front. German forces were advancing deep into Soviet territory. Kiev was about to fall, and many Nazi leaders believed the Soviet Union might collapse before winter. In that atmosphere of confidence, Hitler assumed that deportations carried out now would be only a short step away from the final solution he imagined after victory. The practical question remained: where exactly should the Jews from Germany be sent? Heinrich Himmler soon proposed one answer. Large numbers would be transported to existing ghettos in occupied Poland. One of the places selected for these deportations was the Lodz Ghetto. The authorities were ordered to prepare space for approximately 60,000 Jews from Germany and other parts of the Reich. Yet even as these plans were being discussed, local officials warned that the Lodz Ghetto was already dangerously overcrowded. Among the first people affected by this decision was a 7-year-old German Jewish girl named Lucille Eichengreen. In October 1941, her mother received a registered letter ordering the entire family to prepare to leave Hamburg within 24 hours. At that moment, no one could have predicted how long and difficult their journey through the Nazi camp system would become. The Eichengreen family had already suffered greatly. Lucille's father, a Polish citizen, had been arrested at the beginning of the war and sent to the Dachau concentration camp. About a year and a half later, in February 1941, the family finally received news about him. Gestapo officers arrived at their home wearing their typical uniforms with caps, leather coats, and heavy boots. Lucille later remembered how they entered the kitchen and placed a small metal container on the table. One of the officers said coldly, "Here are the ashes of your father." The family never learned whether the container actually held their father's remains or simply ashes from the crematorium at Dachau. But the message was clear: their father was dead. The loss was devastating, particularly for Lucille's mother and younger sister. The news left them deeply traumatized. Only 8 months later, the family was forced to leave their home forever. Lucille, her mother, and her sister walked through the streets of Hamburg toward the railway station, while other citizens watched them pass. Most people showed no sympathy. Some stared silently, others turned away. A few shouted insults. 16-year-old German Uwe Stor-Johann was one of the residents of Hamburg who watched the Jews walking through the streets. About a fifth of the people watched everything that was happening with great joy, says Uwe, and said, "Thank God these worthless eaters will disappear," or "They are just parasites," and people applauded. However, the majority passed by in silence. It was these people who later made up a large part of those who, after the war, said, "We knew nothing. We saw nothing." One of Uwe's friends had Jewish blood. He had to say goodbye to his beloved aunt and grandmother. The boy himself was not considered fully Jewish. Only one of his grandmothers was Jewish. Therefore, he was allowed to stay, while they had to be taken away. Watching these scenes, Uwe thought, "Thank God you were not born a Jew. But you could just as easily have been, because you do not choose your parents." He also understood that something terrible awaited those people. There was even a market on the streets of Hamburg where belongings left by Jewish families were sold. Many Germans also knew about the killings in the East. A report from December 1942 shows that the Nazis themselves were worried about how this news was affecting the population. It was believed that if the war was lost, the Jews would return and take revenge. Despite this, in October 1941, there were no protests in Hamburg against the deportations. After passing through the city, the 3 women of the Eichengreen family sat down on wooden benches in a third-class train carriage. As the train departed, Lucille realized that it was a journey without a clear destination. The train was going nowhere, and we did not know what to expect. Eventually, they arrived in Lodz, a city in central Poland. The first day in the ghetto shocked them. "We saw sewage flowing through drainage ditches," says Lucille. "We saw old, abandoned houses. We saw the inhabitants of the ghetto. They looked tired, sick, and paid absolutely no attention to us. We did not understand what kind of place this was. Everything seemed completely incomprehensible." When Lucille arrived, the Lodz Ghetto had already been cut off from the outside world for 18 months. The inhabitants were gripped by fear of hunger and disease. Throughout the entire history of the ghetto, more than 1/5 of the people who ended up within its walls died. The conditions were terrible. It is estimated that about 170,000 Jews were forced to live in an area smaller than 4 square kilometers. At first, the Nazis closed the Jews of Lodz in the ghetto without any possibility of earning food. Artur Greiser, who was responsible for the region, wanted the Jews to be forced to give up all their valuables in the face of starvation. To survive under such conditions, one had to be resourceful. One of the first Jews imprisoned in Lodz, Jakob Silberstein, made a deal with Poles living near the ghetto fence. He arranged that a Pole would throw a bundle of bread over the fence. Jakob would eat half of the bread and sell the rest, passing the earned money back over the fence to the Pole. He helped us for 2 months. Later, the Nazis caught that Pole and killed him for it. But 2 months is a long time. Other Jews, in order to obtain food, sold diamond rings and other jewelry. In this way, Poles and ethnic Germans living on the other side of the fence could even make a living. If I can get something worth 5,000 marks for 100 marks, I would be a fool not to buy it, says Egon Zielke, an ethnic German living in Lodz who admits that he earned huge sums from dealings with the inhabitants of the ghetto. After all, Jews would not break a ring, but if they managed to get bread for it, they survived a day or two. You do not need to be a businessman to understand this. Life is simply that disorderly, says Zielke. By November 1940, it became clear to the Nazis that the Jews locked in the Lodz ghetto were no longer hiding any wealth because they had begun to starve. The Nazi authorities were not prepared for this inevitable crisis. Now they had to decide whether to let the Jews die of starvation or to give them the opportunity to work. The head of the German ghetto administration chose the second option. His advisor, despite the obvious evidence around him, still believed that the Jews were hiding money and therefore should not be given food. If it turned out that he was wrong and that the inhabitants of the ghetto truly had nothing left to pay for food, then the rapid disappearance of the Jews should not be a cause for concern. Nevertheless, it was decided to establish workshops in the ghetto, mainly for textile production. Eventually, their number exceeded 100. Those who had jobs received more food than those who did not. This was the principle later used in Nazi administration. Jews were strictly separated into those considered productive and those labeled as useless eaters. The same principle was used in Auschwitz, separating those who could work from those sent directly to the gas chambers. The authorities granted considerable freedom of action to the Jewish Council of the Lodz Ghetto, led by its chairman, Chaim Rumkowski. Rumkowski regulated factory work, food distribution, and controlled the ghetto police, prison, and other local services. People around Rumkowski received different food, says Jakob Silberstein. There were special shops where they collected better rations. They could live quite comfortably. It angered me that a few selected people were so well taken care of, while others were simply ignored. This was the world into which Lucille, her sister, and her mother entered in October 1941. An overcrowded and disease-ridden district where some inhabitants were starving while others visibly better. The newly arrived German Jews entered an already established system and were completely unwanted. They were forced to live wherever space could be found. "We had to sleep on the floor in a school classroom," said Lucille. "There were no beds, no straw, nothing. Once a day we received soup and a small piece of bread." A girl who arrived at the same time as Lucille wrote in her diary. She described what she experienced after getting off the train. "We walk as if in a trance. It feels as if we will walk all the way to eternity. Dilapidated barracks, broken windows, or no windows at all. No cars. Everything is cramped. Men and women drag carts and barrels filled with excrement. Two pull, two push, like beasts of burden." But what caught our attention most were the children. As soon as we passed the barriers, they swarmed around our legs. They only withdrew when policemen approached and ordered them away. Then we reached the final stop, an old school. The courtyard was covered with spilled sewage. Several young men laid down boards so older people could cross without getting their feet wet. They stood in a line and passed the newcomers forward. People crowded and pushed. Classrooms and corridors were turned into sleeping quarters. Wooden bunks stood along the windows, too short to stretch out fully. There was space only for luggage, a suitcase at the foot of the bed, a backpack on top. About 60 people lived in our room. The same number lived in the corridor. Once everyone found a place, they were given a piece of bread that had to last an entire week. In the morning, we were given thin black coffee like brown water. Young women from the ghetto kitchen brought large pots of soup. It could not really be called soup. It was boiled water with green particles floating in it. But everyone rushed to the pots, even those who first said they would not eat. It became clear that nothing else would be given that day. Washing was difficult. There was no water in the taps. You had to go to the courtyard, then stand in lines in the snow at the toilets. Diphtheria was spreading. Every second inhabitant was sick. My hands hurt up to the elbows. The pain does not stop. It becomes worse when I wash in icy water. Rheumatism has returned. Some stretched ropes around their beds to hang laundry. Everyone pressed close together. Children scream, cry, and squeal. Many of the sick groan. Night passes. Morning comes. Then night again. In the morning, the same brown watery soup. The same smell. The same taste. Like ammonia. The smell seeps into the walls and remains until night. It feels like pain in the stomach. A hunger spasm pressing against the forehead. Will I ever get used to this? But the worst thing is resentment. I constantly think that we should have escaped while there was still time. That father cared more about his work at the hospital than about his family. That he did not want to think about me and mother. But I cannot say anything to him. Father has become indispensable on the upper floor. He set up a first aid station for the most seriously ill arrivals. Doctors are needed here. But I cannot sleep. I feel terrible knowing that we have no future anywhere. There must be some way to find help. Otherwise, we will all simply rot and disappear somewhere, in the end. German Jews, in order to get extra food or better living conditions, began to sell their belongings to Polish Jews. It wasn't like a Jew helping a Jew. Lucille was lucky. Her family was of Polish origin, so it was easier for them to negotiate. My mother exchanged a silk blouse for some butter and bread. She was very good at bartering because she spoke Polish. A few weeks later, I gave my leather handbag to a woman who had bread. Looking at the sellers and buyers, I saw a pitiful sight. The buyers were poor. We looked quite well off by comparison. We still wore clothes that resembled Western clothes, and we weren't as hungry as the locals. For example, they would sometimes come to school and say, "I have a private room. If you want to sleep in a bed at night, it will cost you a piece of bread or a certain amount of German money." We received all kinds of offers. German Jews quickly realized that in order to maximize their chances of survival, they had to find work in the ghetto. But this was difficult to do, primarily because of the friction between German and Polish Jews. And the biggest problem that German Jews faced was the lack of acquaintances in the ghetto community. In general, the whole system was quite corrupt, says Lucille. You help me, I'll help you. And people from outside were not allowed into the system. When I first tried to get my sister into a hat factory, it was impossible, because I got answers from the factory directors. What was it to me? In the ghetto, you had to pay for everything one way or another, and nothing was cheap. That's how people lived in the ghetto. I seriously doubted whether they had behaved the same way before the war. I was 17, and I felt overwhelmed. The panic over the arrival of German Jews was not only felt by the people living in the ghetto. The settlers also provoked conflicts among the Nazi leaders in the area. Protests began immediately after Himmler's proposal to deport 60,000 Jews from the Old Reich to Lodz. For this reason, the local national authorities had to improvise in solving the problems of the settlers, sometimes following instructions from Berlin, sometimes on their own initiative. About 7,000 Hamburg Jews were transported to Minsk and settled in a recently cleared part of the ghetto. It was on the occasion of their arrival that almost 12,000 Soviet Jews who had previously lived there were shot. This freed up space for the arriving Hamburg Jews. Jews from Munich, Berlin, and Frankfurt were sent to the Lithuanian city of Kaunas, where about 5,000 of them were shot by members of the 3rd Regiment's Einsatzgruppen. Kaunas was the city where the first German Jews were taken to the east and shot as soon as they arrived. Another convoy reached the Latvian capital Riga on November 30th, and all those who arrived were also shot on the spot. However, such actions contradicted Himmler's wishes. It is known that he called Heydrich and told him not to liquidate the Jewish convoy from Berlin. The SS officer Friedrich Jeckeln, who ordered the massacres in Riga, later received a reprimand from Himmler. These events show that the policy regarding the Jews of the Reich in the autumn of 1941 lacked consistency. Himmler protested the shooting of Jews in Riga, but did not object to the events in Kaunas. By deciding to deport the Jews of the Reich, Hitler began a chain of decisions that would ultimately lead to the extermination of this nation. In the Soviet Union, hundreds of thousands of Jews, men, women, and children, were already being shot by killing squads. What result did Hitler expect by sending so many Jews of the Reich to the same territory? As the months passed, Lucille saw in the Łódź Ghetto that her own living conditions, as well as those of her mother and sister, were steadily deteriorating. "We simply did not have enough food to survive," Lucille says. There was nowhere to get food. The only way to improve the situation was for the girl to get a job, which would mean an extra ration of soup for lunch. So, exhausted, Lucille dragged herself through the streets of the ghetto from one factory to another, looking for work. By May 1942, she still had no job. The Eichengreen family was on the list of people scheduled for deportation. Everyone on the list was unemployed, 9 out of 10 new arrivals. But Lucille knew that she had one advantage over the other German Jews on the list. Her father's family had Polish roots. Carrying our Polish passports, I went from one office to another to have us removed from the list. And in the end, I don't know how, but I succeeded. They let us stay. Lucille herself has no doubt that it was our Polish roots that saved her family. They wanted to take all the Jews of German origin out of the ghetto, she says, and I was able to prove that even though we came from Germany, we were not Germans. It shouldn't have mattered that much. After all, we were all Jews. Between January and May 1942, 55,000 Jews were deported from the Lodz Ghetto to the Chełmno extermination camp and killed there. Chełmno was the first Nazi extermination camp. The deportations were carried out on German orders, but the Nazis used another cynical, divisive measure and forced the Jews in charge of the ghetto to participate in the decision about the people to be deported. The Jews themselves drew up lists. The tension of living in the ghetto greatly affected Lucille's mother. Nothing interested her. She did nothing for days. She was all swollen from hunger. This meant that water had begun to accumulate in her body. She could no longer walk. Her mother died on July 13, 1942 in the ghetto. Every morning, a small black carriage pulled by a gray horse would pass through the streets, in which they collected the dead. They took my mother too. More than a week later, and this was not according to Jewish custom, because we bury the day after death, my sister and I found an empty place, dug a hole, and took our mother there. The cart only collected the dead, but did not bury them. We did not have a coffin, only 2 boards tied with rope. We found those boards in a large building near the cemetery. It was full of corpses, unburied bodies. We buried my mother. We left a small wooden sign on the grave. It, of course, disappeared very quickly. Lucille and her younger sister turned into 2 ghetto orphans trying their best to survive. We didn't feel anything. We didn't say prayers, we didn't cry. We were numb and emotionless. After my mother died, from that moment on, my sister almost stopped talking. She didn't say a word. She was extremely intelligent, tall, and very beautiful, but she had no words worth uttering. She knew that my mother was giving us the last remnants of food so that we could survive. My sister distanced herself. My mother asked me to promise to take care of her, but I could do nothing. I tried, but I couldn't. 2 months later, the Germans themselves came to the ghetto to conduct selections, looking for those who were no longer fit for work, the old, the sick, and the too young. Rumkowski, the leader of the ghetto's Jews, asked the women to cooperate and give their children to the Germans. "Give up your children so that we can stay alive," he said. When I heard those words, I was 17, Lucille says. I could no longer understand how anyone could ask parents to give up their children. I still don't understand it. People shouted, "How can you ask that? How can we do this?" And he replied, "If we don't do this, it will only get worse." Lucille did everything she could to have her younger sister spared. She put on makeup and encouraged her to try to look strong and healthy. Lucille had a little hope because her sister was 12, and the Germans automatically selected only those aged 11 and under. But when the Nazis came, they took the girl away anyway. They took my sister. This shouldn't have happened. I tried to sneak into the truck with her. They hit me in the arms with the butt of a gun, didn't let me get in, and eventually the truck disappeared from sight. However, as Lucille watched in despair as her sister was taken away, she had no idea that the young girl was heading straight for her death. We never even thought about what they would do with people who were very young or very old and unable to work. We didn't think rationally enough to understand what awaited them. We just hoped that the deportees would survive. Completely alone and emotionally broken, Lucille forced herself to keep trying to find work in the ghetto. Eventually, through an acquaintance, she found one of the few jobs she could find. She was helped by another German Jew from Hamburg. He convinced Rumkowski that the ghetto should be restored by creating parks and open spaces, and Lucille helped him design it. A few months later, Rumkowski closed that department. But by then, Lucille had already made more useful connections. One of her new acquaintances, who had come from Vienna, worked in the administration department in the same building. And with her help, Lucille got another job, filling out applications to the Germans for coal for the coming winter. Up until then, Lucille's time in the ghetto had taught her one cruel lesson. You really couldn't trust anyone. If I told a colleague something, she would use it for her own purposes. You had to be very careful. Backstabbing happened everywhere, and that was understandable. Everyone was saving their own skin. It was a matter of life and death. One day, Rumkowski came to the office. At that time, he was looking for workers for a new factory in the ghetto. Lucille was terrified at the thought of meeting him, because the 66-year-old Jew, who looked like a kind-hearted grandfather, had a bad reputation. I had heard rumors. I knew that he had a quick temper. When he got angry, he would beat people with his stick. He was an absolute dictator, as much as the restrictions imposed by the Germans allowed. I think most of the ghetto residents were afraid of him. Lucille hid in the corridor, wanting to remain unnoticed. But her name was on the list, and eventually the girl was invited to see Rumkowski. He was sitting on a chair, gray-haired, with dark glasses, holding his cane in his right hand, and for a moment, he resembled a king sitting on a throne. He asked me where I was from, what languages I knew, what my father did for a living, where my family members were, and if any were still there. When I answered the questions, his last words were, "And you will certainly hear from me." At that moment, I did not attach any importance to this phrase. After Rumkowski's visit, the boss transferred Lucille to the statistics department. I do not know why they transferred me. Maybe they wanted to hide me, because that department was very quiet and secluded. But it did not take long before Rumkowski's secretary was called. The head of the ghetto Jews wanted Lucille. When she entered the main administrative building, she saw a number of girls of a similar age already gathered. Rumkowski employed them all in the new kitchen for deserving workers. Some women worked as waitresses in the dining room, while others, including Lucille, worked in an office set up nearby. I was told that if I received, say, 50 kilograms of beets, I would have to count how many servings of food I could make from them. Lucille received one extra serving of food every day for working in the new kitchen. It was a serious reward, she says. As they say, she was devastated. As Lucille was preparing for her new job, her former boss gave her one last piece of advice about Rumkowski. It seems to me that he used the Polish word for pig, and he was right. In almost every ghetto established by the Nazis, the leader of the Jewish community acted responsibly, but Lodz was an exception. Rumkowski was said to have put people on the lists of deportees because he wanted to get rid of them, and Lucille would soon find out for herself that the leader of the Jewish community did not shy away from personal harassment. When Lucille started working in the kitchen, she quickly realized that this kitchen was just a project for Rumkowski's toys. He visited every other night. Soon the girl began to look forward to these visits with dread. He could be heard arriving in a horse-drawn carriage. Then he would come into the kitchen, inspect the waitress, and if her apron was not tied properly, he would hit her with his stick. He would also inspect the food, but he would not eat it. That would have been out of character for him. Then he would turn into the office, and I would hear his uneven step down the corridor, as if he had been snoring a little. He would invite me into his office. We would be alone in the room. He would pull up a chair, and we would talk. He would talk, and I would listen. He would harass me, take my hand, put it on his, and he would say, "Come back." I would pull away and he would come closer. It was a terrible relationship. I felt overwhelmed. He wanted me to move into his private apartment, which only he could enter, and I started crying. I didn't want to move anywhere. I didn't understand how anyone could behave like that. But acceptance in the ghetto was a real value, exchanged like anything else. Lucille's participation in this exchange was truly involuntary, but she was real. If she didn't let herself be exploited by Rumkowski, it could cost her life. If I had escaped, he would have deported me. It was completely obvious. Rumkowski really did use young women. This is confirmed by Jakob Zilberstein, who saw how the leader of the Jewish community behaved when he saw a young girl he liked. We would sit in the dining room. He would just come over, put his arm around the employee's waist, and take her out. After a few weeks, the kitchen closed. Lucille and Rumkowski quickly got fed up with her, and she was sent to the ghetto leather factory to make belts for the German army. She never saw Rumkowski again. The damage that the Jew had done was all that remained. I felt disgusted, angry. I felt used. In 1944, the ghetto was finally closed, and Lucille and Rumkowski, along with the other last ghetto residents, went to Auschwitz. Rumkowski hoped that his situation would save him and his family. The old Jew died with his family in the Birkenau gas chamber. Lucille was a young woman, so she was selected not for death, but for work. And when Auschwitz was liberated in 1945, the girl was saved.